In this episode, we'll welcome back a previous guest to discuss research that indicates that the workplace can expose pregnant people to psychosocial harm that will not only affect them, but the offspring that they carry. That's a conversation about psychosocial safety for pregnant workers up next on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each week, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk psychological health and safety. Well, welcome to this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Our goal for each episode is to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. Despite some legal protections, many pregnant workers encounter subtle and overt forms of bias, such as being perceived as less competent, excluded from key projects, or reassigned to less desirable roles. These experiences can lead to heightened stress, anxiety, diminished self-esteem, especially when accompanied by intrusive comments and social isolation. The pressure to maintain productivity while managing physical symptoms and emotional changes can intensify feelings of guilt or inadequacy. Additionally, fear of retaliation or job insecurity may discourage employees from requesting accommodations or taking necessary leave. For those returning postpartum, challenges like inadequate lactation support, rigid scheduling, and lack of reintegration planning can further strain psychological well-being. Without inclusive policies and empathetic leadership, pregnancy becomes not just a personal transition, but a workplace vulnerability, one that demands systemic change to ensure dignity, equity, and mental health. So my guest in this episode is, in my view, one of the nation's top voices on this issue. Grounded in a combination of both scholarship and lived experience. Interestingly, it's a returning guest from episode 96, coming back to have another conversation with me here on the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. So let's dive into it. For those who didn't catch that episode, you might want to go back and relook at it anyway. But to just reintroduce my guest with an introduction of my guest, by my guest with this question: who is Dr. Heliana Ramirez?
Well, I am a grateful person to be invited back. I think one of Dr. I. David Daniels' greatest fans, because I talk about your work all the time. And besides the relationship to this podcast, I am a licensed independent social worker. I'm a racial and LGBTQ related workplace trauma therapist and researcher. And I'm an expert witness. I am somebody who has experienced workplace abuse and have worked with people in civilian society, military, veteran communities as well, who have experienced everything from workplace mobbing and bullying to whistleblower retaliation. And I would say that ultimately I am a believer that racialized labor trauma has happened to many of us, not just in our lives, but in our parents' lives and our grandparents and other generations prior. And that what happens in the workplace, I know, impacts us across generations. And so it's a matter of public health for us to consider what happens in the workplace, especially to pregnant workers.
Right. And you answered this question once before, but I'm going to ask it again because I ask everybody who comes on, because your thoughts may have evolved since the last time we chatted, at least recorded anyway. So what does psychological health and safety mean to you?
Well, today, since we're going to be talking about a study that I did on employees who are pregnant in hostile and abusive workplaces. I will say that psychological safety in the workplace involves pregnant workers being able to do their jobs without fear of retaliation when they are caring for their health and the health of the fetus and the safety and health of their baby. And I would argue that psychologically safe workplaces for pregnant workers and postpartum workers is good for business. A lot of people don't understand, Dr. Daniels, that when a person has a baby, major changes happen not just into the body, but into the brain. That there is a rewiring literally of the brain that happens during pregnancy and postpartum. And there is an incredible harnessing of energy and creativity that most of us are not aware of unless we've actually given birth and had to figure out how to juggle keeping another human being alive while the rest of the world is going on. So I would argue that actually psychological safety in the workplace for pregnant workers is good for pregnant workers, it's good for the babies, but it's also good for the business.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I find it interesting that we exist in a society that almost forces and demands that we prioritize business, money, profit, production over human beings. I just find that really, really interesting because, to your point, how could it not be good for the organization that needs human beings to have a new human being show up on the planet that is also healthy and safe and able to do what the human beings who brought them here could do? That for the success of the species, for the success of business, for the success of the community is necessary, because if there are no new humans, then eventually we become extinct and everything falls apart. But all of these conversations, I spent, you probably recall me making this declaration. I spent most of my life working in the public sector and didn't really think so much about what stuff cost and all. So I didn't necessarily have to make that argument most of the time. And I found post that part of my life that you always have to say, well, it's good for the business. And I think it's more important that it's good for the humans. I do. And this research that you've done, first of all, is just fascinating because I'm trying to think if I've ever met someone who's done research on on the psychological and physical issues that are going on with pregnant people in the workplace. I just don't think I could. I can't think of anybody. It's certainly not been as being someone who is not physiologically capable of, of giving birth myself. I have certainly participated in the births of other humans, but have been in the room but it hasn't been me. And so what motivates a person to do research on pregnant people in the workplace? Where does that come from?
It comes from lived experience, Dr. Daniels. It comes from having been pregnant in a vapidly toxic work environment and being Chicana, being underrepresented in doctoral programs, underrepresented in managerial positions in my industry, and having learned from a very early age that I had to give 150% of myself to make it in school, to make it in higher education, and to make it in the workplace. And I had been conditioned to work hard, 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 hard. And if I'm in an environment where I'm not, where I'm running into barriers, well, by golly, I'll just work harder. And that's what I did. And I was mobbed out of a job postpartum. And I woke up without a job that I had given everything to, too much of myself to. Dr. Daniels, I am so embarrassed to say I gave up evenings and weekends when my baby needed me because I was in an exploitative workplace where they gave me too much work. And I sadly didn't walk away. I thought that it would be the safest thing for my baby and my family for me to secure a better paying job. I knew I was in an abusive workplace and I knew I needed to leave, and I applied for other jobs. So here I am working 60 hours a week, raising a baby, and looking for other work. And I received other job offers and I turned them down because they were not higher pay, because I had been socialized to think that in my career, always move up, always move up. And that means that we are taking jobs that have more, institutional power or have a better salary or whatever, that there's only one way, one trajectory in a job. And so I woke up the day after I was illegally terminated from my position, um, to a baby who was really, who was having a hard time. And I um, started to get into some of the research and learning that what happens in the womb, this is the first environment that we're in. And babies' brains grow something like 50 billion cells a second. It is really, really significant when there are changes to the pregnant person's body chemistry, like flooding of stress hormones in a chronically stressful workplace. That's what happens. That chronic exposure to stress hormones in utero impact the development of the fetus. And those health hazards or health outcomes can last a lifetime. And so I decided to talk to other people who had been pregnant in abusive workplaces to find out what had happened to them and their babies. And what I found was horrifying. I interviewed 18 people across multiple countries, across multiple job positions, and every single one of us had serious health outcomes to both us and to our babies. Multiple women, they were all of the people that I interviewed identify as women. Um, and so from here on out, I'll describe them as women workers and pregnant women. But there are some transgender men who choose to have babies as well, which is just for folks who aren't familiar. That's why I was using pregnant people. But several of the women in my study had miscarriages. One woman had a stillbirth. She was in the hospital attached to machines, and her job was demanding to know when she was going to come back to work. She was in a very high, powerful position, and she said to them, I can't come back. I'm attached to machines right now. And and the baby died, and she had to give birth to a deceased baby. And the autopsy determined that there was no infection. There was no infection of this woman's body or the placenta or the uterus, or there was no part of, they could not find a physiological reason for that baby dying. What they determined was that it was a stress related death. Most of the women in this study who had babies that were born premature or who had developmental delays, they didn't roll over or sit up or start speaking at the point when the average baby does. Most of the women said things like, I always wondered to what extent was my workplace abuse or bullying or mobbing related, but they'll never be able to know for sure. But this one woman, literally, the hospital told her that they determined that the baby probably died because of stress that she had been under. So, what was shocking to me, I mean, you asked the question of why did I do this research in the first place? It's from my lived experience. It's also from the concern of I've been both a manager as well as a frontline employee. I am a mental health clinician and a trauma therapist. And so I'm very much interested in the ways that trauma intergenerationally impact us and impact our futures. So that, I guess, would be the other reason as well.
Wow. That is, that's actually kind of heavy because I think about all of the many people that we've all come across over the course of our lives that have all kinds of all kinds of challenges. You name them, particularly ones that are, psychological in nature, but even ones that are physical in nature, because you're talking about how this organism is growing and developing and trying to become, what it's programmed to be, a healthy human being. And there's this stress and this lack of nutrition and the trauma of physical and sometimes, the sexual abuse, all kinds of other kinds of abuse going on to the person carrying this new human. And then we're surprised when this human shows up and has delays and has all kinds of other challenges. That's what that's what they've been exposed to. I don't know that there's always, always intent. I honestly, a lot of these environments, workplaces that are severely abusive, I don't think there's the intent. I just think that's what they are. That is what they are. They were in some cases designed to be safe for one group, and they turn out to be abusive to everybody else other than that one group. And it just gets normalized. That's what we do. When women come to work here, they got to deal with this and and a lot of that comes from those who don't gender identify as women, but a lot of it comes from other women who have normalized the behavior and normalized, well, if I want to rise up the corporate ladder, I've got to go out there and I've got to go to the dinner parties and I've got to stay out late and I've got to work 80, 90 hours a week. And why does anybody have to work those kind of hours? Let alone someone who is in the process of bringing forth life into the world. Oh my goodness, oh dear. And so, yeah, a lot of it is, I don't think it's about intent at all. And frankly, it doesn't matter what the intent was. It matters the effect that it's having on other humans. It just, wow.
I'm so glad that you brought up the abuse that can happen between women in a workplace when one of the women is pregnant. I absolutely agree with you that there are women who say, well, in order for me to have made it, I had to do all of these things. I expect you to do that irrespective of whether or not you're pregnant. I also found, and this was a really distressing and sobering thing to learn, that many of the women, the people who were abusive towards them at work, were other women. They were other women who had delayed, postponed, chosen not to have children of their own, who seemed to have regret and jealousy over their pregnant coworker's pregnancy and were vicious towards them because they were acting out their own dismay with their own lives. They were furious that they had lost the opportunity to have children of their own, or they had given it up, or what have you. And so it was a seemingly like a punishment that these other women had figured out a way to do both, to have a career and to have a child of their own. That's one of the things that happened to me in my workplace. And I just thought it was just kind of a one-off thing, but interviewing these other women, it was a pattern that emerged. Another pattern that emerged was women, as soon as they would disclose that they were pregnant, suddenly they would start to lose access to job opportunities. This is like before they even went on maternity leave. But the title of the article that I wrote in this book, Corporate Blues, The Untold Stories of Women in Toxic Workplaces, this is presented by Dr. Carrie Yazid. The chapter that I wrote is called Mobbing on Maternity Leave, How Workplace Abuse Impacts Pregnant Workers and Their Babies. And while the title talks about maternity leave in particular, which is, I think, a uniquely vulnerable moment for women or any pregnant worker to lose their job position, to lose opportunities for a promotion that they would have otherwise earned, but also to be fired and to be constructively discharged. That means, for folks who aren't aware, they're made so uncomfortable in the workplace that they flee to maintain their own sanity, to protect their health or their reputation at work. But that the maternity leave itself is a uniquely vulnerable point when that can happen. But many of the women in the study, as soon as they announced that they were pregnant, the abusive behavior started. A lot of these people, they didn't experience it just when they went on maternity leave. So I think back to your initial question of like, what does psychological safety look like? I think part of it is being really, really clear for HR to know that this is a uniquely vulnerable time for workers, to be aware that there can be, much we like to say, like, hey, leave your personal business at home. And when you come clock in 9 to 5, none of that. But that's not reality. We are human beings, we are complex, and people all the time will act out based on their own sense of inadequacy or their own fears. And it translates into hiring decisions, and it translates into who gets promoted or not. So I think part of the psychological safety that we need is for HR to be uniquely made aware that it's not just a matter of, do they know what kind of maternity leave benefits are available for the workers, but how do they position themselves and the workforce and prepare their managers, for example, to know how to protect those workers once they disclose that they're pregnant.
Right, right, right. Yeah, and I think that's particularly important in a country that doesn't provide, like a lot of other industrialized countries do, doesn't provide adequate leave for parents to care for their children. It just doesn't. There's this expectation, it's it's kind of like, and I don't know whether I don't haven't done the research myself, but the story that I hear is back in chattel slavery days. The woman go out in the field and have the baby and be back to work picking cotton pretty quick. And some of the other people pick the baby up and go clean the baby, but they got to get them back to work. And again, I don't know whether that's historically accurate or not, but a lot of our work situations seem to, first of all, a lot of workers hide their pregnancy as long as possible because they know that they're not going to get adequate time off to care for themselves. Now, that's except in cases, and it's even difficult in those cases when they are on bed rest or some other type of medical non-pregnancy related. It's related to pregnancy, but they think, oh, that's another medical thing, so we can give it to you. But it's this whole mindset, and again, this is a mindset that I believe was probably created by people who can't have children. Men, generally. Oh yeah, that's not important. We need to get them back in here because so that stuff really. They're strong enough to have that baby. They're strong enough to get back into work within a couple of weeks or whatever it is. And so again, when those that are pregnant know that system, they already know enough about the system to know they're not going to get the time that they need. So they have to. First, I probably can't tell, and then when I am off, I'm thinking about when am I going to have to go back and that type of thing. There's probably a lot of stress associated with that process itself, let alone, the fact that, employers or other folks in the workforce feel like this is our chance to get rid of that Ramirez lady. This is our chance to kind of push her out. You're making me think about when my wife was pregnant with our youngest son. She was working at a bank. It was actually a banking center. It wasn't the bank, but it was a center who did process checks or whatever they did. And they were doing some downsizing or layoffs or whatnot. And had laid all these people off. And I guess, now it's interesting to think about it now. She was the only person left and she was pregnant. The only person left. And she eventually left after she had my youngest son anyway. But they created this environment. But she just, kind of said, look, you're not going to push me out. We're probably both that way a little bit. You're not going to push me out. So I'm just going to sit here and, frankly, there's nothing you can do because I do good work. I was doing good work the rest of the time. I was in good standing. But they set her in an empty floor. The only person on the floor was her over in the corner someplace and wouldn't talk to her and all this other kind of stuff. And all these years later, I go like, wow, it's just all of that going on for people. And all of that is being, the embryo that becomes the fetus, that becomes the human, is exposed to all that stuff.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm so um, glad and chilled that you bring up the history of chattel slavery. And we also see this with colonization. And we also see it with contemporary farm working. Latinas and Filipinas, when there was a large Filipino workforce in the fields in California, Arizona, Nevada, and so on, it very commonly would give birth in the fields, just like you're saying. We're not talking hundreds of years ago, we're talking more recently that in order the way that the system is set up is so that you and I can have access to a whole bunch of veggies and fruit that's not exorbitantly priced. It requires a workforce that is underpaid and exploited. And the babies of the people who are used up like that are not seen as babies. They are seen as less than human. And this is a thing that continues today and that is directly related to the choices that we make at the grocery store too. So, part of the reason why I always really enjoy chatting with you is that I find that you acknowledge how complex these systems are and these situations are, and how we are all complicit to some extent or another in this. And it doesn't do any good for us to demonize people who are making decisions or policy practices or hiring practices that they may or may not know are going to have deleterious impacts on real people's lives. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're doing it from intent or not. What matters is the outcome of it. And I think that Dr. Gabor Mate has written about a book that's called The Myth of Normal, Trauma and Healing in a Toxic Society. And he talks about how serious of a danger and damage is done to society when we force our pregnant workers and our workers who have recently had babies, both women who might have given birth to babies or other pregnant people, and any partner that they might have, regardless of what that partner's gender might be. When we force those people to go back to work too soon, we are undermining the brain development of those babies. So when we moved from a species that walked on four legs to becoming upright, two-legged walkers, part of the way that that happened, in order to balance on 2 feet, we had to have smaller pelvises. In order to get the babies out, the babies' brains had to be born essentially underdeveloped. So in the first several months after birth, that brain is literally growing massive amounts of neuronal pathways in the brain. And the way that those parts of the brain grow are through what we call attachment. It's through an adult typically and the baby mirror neurons. The baby goes goo 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 and the parent goes goo goo goo. And it's that back and forth interaction that's literally growing new neural pathways. So what happens in a capitalist society that requires our workforce to hand a baby off to a child care provider who has way too many babies? So there's no way they can engage like that. We're literally undermining, if we're just purely going to look at this from a workplace business perspective, we are undermining our future generation of workers. What we're doing to the parents or the caregivers, however, who have also, their bodies have been primed to want that time and that interaction, we are causing anxiety, depression. In some cases, we're even causing post-traumatic stress disorder, moral injury to these working parents who are, their hearts are breaking and their souls are being cracked open because they know that their baby needs them. One of the women in the study, Dr. Daniels, she talked about she gave birth to a baby who had severe acid reflux. And she talked about having to drive him to the daycare center and showing up day after day after day with this child just covered in vomit. But she had no choice. She had to leave him there. And it broke her heart every single time because she knew that baby needed her. But she also knew that in order to keep a roof over the baby's head, she had to stay at work. So we're putting these workers in impossible situations where there is no way out. There's no way to defend against the violence and the abuse, and there's no way to escape it. And that's what turns stress into trauma. That's the defining piece, is when we can't defend or escape. So we are knowingly then traumatizing the workforce. We are damaging a potential future workforce. And this is some of what Dr. Gabor Mate talks about in that book, The Myth of Normal, meaning that we've all normalized all of this. We've all said, oh, okay, well, yeah, you have a baby, you're going to go back to work and so on.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish DX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow Flourish DX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the Flourish DX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
So, chat a little bit about how just, I obviously can't reproduce the entire thing, but what are some of the research questions that you were trying to answer in this study that you did? Just one or two of them, that particular things you were trying to figure out.
So this was an exploratory study. I also am not aware of any other study that specifically looked at pregnant workers in hostile or abusive bullying kinds of environments at work. So I was really generally trying to figure out what was the interviewee's health experience and mental health experience, and what was the experience of the baby, the fetus. Most of the people in this study, they carried to term and they delivered. There were several babies who were born prematurely. And then the one woman that I mentioned who gave birth to a stillbirth, her baby died. But I was also asking, describe the work environment. What actually happened to you? What kinds of psychological, as you described, psychosocial hazards, abuses were you exposed to? And what was the ultimate outcome on your career? And what I learned was horrifying. I interviewed one woman who was having, it wasn't Braxton Hicks, it was much more severe than that, extreme cramping in her stomach months before she was supposed to give birth. She was a social worker at a school, and her employer was, as I was describing, one of these women who had not had children. And it seems like she just had an axe to grind with this woman. And she would force her to go out into all these schools to do the school assessments. She could have given her desk duty, essentially. So she could have kept her feet up, still gotten the work done. And importantly, this interviewee is a Black woman, white women in the same office, also pregnant, and they were given these kinds of accommodations. Sadly, Dr. Daniels, the woman who did this to her, though, was a Black woman. And I think that's the other piece that really came through in this study, is realizing that women can be violent towards other women at work. Black women can hurt other Black women at work. And sometimes we all internalize the ideas, like the
Internalized depression. Yeah,
that's exactly
yes,
right.
Yes.
So if this Black woman who is a manager says, well, I can push through everything and I've been forced to push through everything, I'm going to make you do that as well. Unfortunately, that's when we start to see the intersectionality, right? It's the racism plus the gendered sexism in an environment that is not set up for either women or people of color, and especially not women of color.
Yes. Wow. So, there's a part of me that is just so amazed that this hasn't been, that someone hadn't thought about this. It happens to so many people, and I think we've both been, mentioning how, maybe it was you're talking about in the book, how this has just been normalized. People have that's just the way it is. That's just the way it is. It happened to me. It happened to my grandmother. It happened to my aunt. It happened to my sister. It happened to everybody. That's just the way it is. So as a society, we accept the implications and impact of this kind of behavior. And instead of going back to look at the work environment itself and changing it so it is more healthy for the pregnant people that we decided to bring in here. Because, if there's a part of me that says with all psychosocial and other kinds of safety related issues, If you don't want to make it safe for the people you're going to bring in, don't bring in those kinds of people then. That, okay? So if you want to put a sign up that says, that the only people we will hire have to be male, why don't you do that? Now, there are going to be some consequences to that. But, okay, it would be more intellectually honest than to say, oh, yeah, we really want to bring in women and people of color and disabled people and gay people, whoever. But then when they get there, it's just miserable. And it's miserable generation after generation. It's not like they're having been the first, the few, and the only, I know it's tough for us, but it doesn't get better because, to your point, it gets passed on from one generation of worker to the next generation of worker. It gets embedded into the selection process. It gets embedded into the assessment process, into the promotions, we embed this nonsense that ultimately is harmful to everyone. It's not only harmful to that woman, to that, that pregnant person, to their significant other, whoever they may, their partner, and to that child. It's harmful to us too, because the process, once that person is gone, we have to find somebody else. And turnover is a thing. It is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we also pay the cost to society when we give birth to a whole bunch of babies that need therapy, that need extra support in the classroom, that need significant medical attention. There were babies in this study, Dr. Daniels, who were born with cancer. Babies born with cancer, exposed to toxins that were so severe. Part of, I think, what can happen in many of our communities, especially, like you said, the first, the few, the only. And I just want to give a shout out to the amazing, there's a gentleman named Michael who recently published a book called The First, the Few, the Only, and it's just incredible. Michael Thornhill is his name. So just a shout out to him. But, for the first, the few, the only, many of us have been told by previous generations, ay, mija, keep your head down. It's a good job. Don't do anything to draw attention to yourself. Those were survival skills that were needed by previous generations. Now we've got some new laws that are in place that say that you can't discriminate against people. And we know it happens all the time, but I feel like we're in somewhat of like an extra tight spot in society right now, because on the one hand, we've got the laws that say you can't do that. But on the other hand, we've got people who are still functioning consciously and subconsciously based on a system of inequity. And there's a group of people who assume that they have entitlement to all the power and all the access, and anyone who's different and anyone who says, well, hey, you can't talk like that around me, or you can't do that around me, that's not fair and that's illegal, they get very upset. So I do think that part of the challenge is that we've got enough people who have made it through higher ed, who are people of color, who are women, who are queer, or what have you, and we're smart, and many of us are actually quite smart, and we had to be to overcome all the barriers that we had to get through in the first place.
That's right.
And that dynamic is what puts us in even more danger in workplaces when we're around imposter leaders, people who are promoted without the necessary required skills, training, subject matter expertise, and what have you. They find those of us who have natural talent, who are interpersonally skilled, and who choose not to engage in illegal and unethical behavior, they find us to be an existential threat to their unearned power and privilege. So then you throw on something like pregnancy, and that just makes it too easy to tip the scales. But one of the things that I think about, like, as I think, okay, Ramirez, this is such like a downer. Always trying to give a little hope, right? Give a little hope. I think that we have some really untapped avenues for potential change here. And I think one of them are OBGYNs. It is very common for many OBGYNs to ask a pregnant patient, is anyone hurting you at home? I would like for them to ask, and is anyone hurting you at work?
At work.
Yes. Whoa, Dr. Daniels, what if we got OBGYNs to start working with psych, health, and safety folks like yourself, occupational safety folks? What a huge return on investment it would be for society at large. I really am hopeful that we have the research now available about What happens when we're developing in utero? We know also that we can heal. Even we can heal many of our babies that have been harmed from exposure to stress hormone flooding in utero and through breast milk, because that's also another thing that can happen. It's the constant, it's just, we were not built as human beings to constantly be flooded by stress hormones. It was like, have enough stress hormones to get away from the saber-toothed tiger that was chasing us way back in the day, right? It was not to get away from the vapidly dangerous workplace abuser. But even those kinds of injuries that happen to our physical health, that happen to our mental health, these can be healed because the body, our human bodies were designed to recover from imbalance. So I do think there's a lot of reason for hope, but I think ultimately we really need to be preparing our workforce. We need to be training HR, but also preparing women who are entering the workforce and anyone who decides to become pregnant to know this is a potential period of vulnerability and this is how you can protect yourself. And ultimately, I wish that I had had a different value system. I'll be honest with you, Dr. Daniels. Mexican ancestry people, part of how racism happens in the US, our value is completely and totally only tied to our labor. And I wish that I had known that about myself, that I had worked so hard to get through school, as many of us do, or people of color in higher ed, predominantly white institutions, and that my ability to grind, gosh darn it, and work harder than anybody else around me would be a vulnerability, would put me at risk and my baby. I wish that I had had some support in thinking through that earlier on.
Wow. Oh boy. Yeah, it sounds so familiar. I think about the times that, that's the way I got through. We the the conversations that were held in my household about you're going to have to be twice as good, as the other folks. You're going to have to work harder than everybody else. And I tell folks I started losing my hair in my 30s. And I don't think it was just genetic. I think it was stress. I really do. I mean, I promoted fast and got in charge of things really early, and didn't really have. There was no one in my family who had ever been a supervisor of anybody or anything. So I was learning all this stuff kind of on my own, and the mentors were hard to find. I found some, but and I'm saying all this to say, but though it sounds like in both our cases there were some things that we were told as we were coming up that caused us to be who we were. But on the other hand, what a blessing it is now to have someone like yourself, Dr. Ramirez, who has done the work, who has the academic and scientific backup for the work that you've done, that can now share it with others. This plague, this scenario doesn't have to continue if folks were simply able to open up to this research that you're done. So as we start to wrap, if you had the opportunity to sit with, pick your size of workplace, and wanted to give them just a couple of things that they could do to create a psychologically healthier and safer environment for pregnant workers and pregnant people, what would you share? 2 or 3 things that you might share that they could do to, if they want to get better?
So the first thing is I would say that maternity leave is really a gift in a psychologically safe work environment for a pulse check of the workforce. In many workforces, especially organizations that are growing quickly or that are facing pressure points like significant loss in funding, like we're seeing in the last couple of years here, or a reduction in workforce or what have you, those moments of organizational pressure points are risk factors for increasing mobbing, bullying behavior. When somebody goes on maternity leave, it's an opportunity for the workforce to take a breath, to take a pause and take a beat and check in. How are we doing with the distribution of labor? Because we're going to need to redistribute some of that work when this person goes on leave. It's actually, and oftentimes we think about it, oh, we're doing a service to that employee, but actually it could be a service to everyone who's in the workforce, because it's an opportunity for us to check and see, like, well, how is everybody doing here? And how do we, maybe reassign some things that will be for everyone's health? So I think that's the first piece, is to think about it as an opportunity for everyone. The second piece would be to say that when we create environments like lactation rooms or single stall bathrooms where there might be a changing table for a baby, those oftentimes benefit other people. Just like when the American Disabilities movement created cutouts in the sidewalks. It's not just people in wheelchairs who benefit from those sidewalk cutouts. It's also people who are pushing strollers and people who are walking with canes and so on. So again, when we make modifications that increase accessibility for one group, it oftentimes has a benefit for others too. So, for example, when I worked at Veterans Affairs for many years and I created a single stall bathroom project, as the director of an LGBT staff and allies program, I also brought in the Federal Women's Group. I also brought in the employees resource group for people who are living with disabilities, because we all benefited from it. So it was an opportunity to actually strengthen the fabric of our workforce, our diverse workforce. So I think that that's another thing that I would say, is it's an opportunity for us. And then the final thing is, don't count out that pregnant worker or that worker who's just given birth. They have just literally done a miracle. Yes, it's a miracle that's happened since the beginning of humanity, but the brain and the body, yes, exhausted, are also uniquely positioned to use energy differently than before pregnancy. So many times you'll find that pregnant workers, and especially people who have just given birth, yes, they're tired, but they are learning how to maximize their productivity even with reduced energy output. So I think that there's a missed opportunity when we don't ask our recently delivered postpartum employees, what do you think we could do to increase productivity around here? I bet you they have
Wow.
unique insights.
Wow. 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 Yeah. Oh boy. The example that you gave about how we distribute the workload of someone who is on maternity leave, that process is also applicable when people are off for other reasons, for injuries, for illnesses, for so it's an opportunity to strengthen that process, because it doesn't matter why the person is off. It matters that they are off. They're going to be off for a period of time. And how do we adjust to the fact that they're not here? They're just not here. I mean, Matt, there's a part of me that says that the entire concept of sick leave just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, that people should be able to have days that they don't show up at work and they still get paid. Uh, and as you know, they aren't going to show up here, and as long as they let us know, they're not going to. And frankly, if you want to have a number, that's great. But the reason really doesn't matter. They're just not here. And that would also, I think, some of these organizations who are struggling with, workers who are struggling with all kinds of mental health challenges, they don't have to disclose, I won't be there today, and I need to not be there today. Or as we've learned in the last, 5 years since the since the pandemic, they don't need to be physically here. They need to be in a different kind of space. But all of these are predictable when and certainly managed better when we've worked through that process and we have a person who's going to be off anyway. It's a chance for us to refine those processes. And again, to your point, it works for everyone. There's a benefit to everyone. So Dr. Ramirez, before we conclude, if there are folks out there who want to learn more about your research, want to learn more about your writings, want to contact you, want to reach out to you and perhaps even continue the conversation, what's the best way to do that?
Thank you for asking. So I am on LinkedIn. I'd love connecting with folks. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn. My private practice, I provide online therapy to folks in Ohio and British Columbia. You can find me on Psychology Today. I have also a page on Headway. And then I have my own company, which if you search Workplace Trauma Recovery, I provide coaching. as well as I do speaking engagements and expert witness testimony for folks. I just can't thank you enough for the way that you handle these interviews, Dr. Daniel. Seriously, like it was really lovely. That last piece that you just talked about of, that we should just expect that people are going to take time off of work. And I feel like this is part of the challenge that we have coming from the industrial era in the United States, where we are not machines.
We're not.
We're not.
We're not.
And
We're not.
it's better for everyone because when we realize that, because even our executives are not machines. But too often our executives are getting burned out as well because they are working themselves like machines too.
That's right.
And there's another way for us to talk about the value of business. There's another way to talk about the value of life for us and for future generations if we can start to critically analyze what is the most important thing here. And so thank you for bringing that back every time I talk to you.
Yes, yeah. Well, and we should be closing, but I'm tossing this one last thing that back in the early 1900s, there was a fellow by the name of Robert Taylor who is credited to be the father of scientific management. He had some pretty important views, I think, about how work should be measured, but and how it should be managed. That's the concept of manager kind of comes out of his work. And so there was certainly some value there. But to that, and it is his views that he is important in that conversation, that ended up in our business schools and in our business practices and such, was this whole concept of scientific management. But at the same time, there was someone who didn't identify as a man. Mary Parker Foley had a different but similar approach to the same thing, her thoughts were around how can we create an environment where human beings can work together to accomplish important things and create environments where they can be at their best. What would it have been like? What would we be as a society if we listened to both, not just the he but the she? Why, if we considered both of those? Because I am of the belief that we shouldn't be either or, we should be both, because both are important. And but we're getting there slowly but surely. I want to believe as a species we're going to get there, because I think we're starting to realize that these industrialized systems that we've created are not as healthy for us as human beings. They're great for machines. They don't work well for human beings. And we need folks, Dr. Ramirez, like yourself, to help us pick apart those pieces that we hadn't thought about before. So again, thank you so much for your scholarship and for your the bold way you go about talking about things that sometimes we're suffering. We just don't want to talk about it. And you're willing to talk about it and talk about your own experience, which I think is helpful. I really do. So thank you so much for the time. It actually took us a while because you got a lot going on in your life. I got a lot going on in mine as well, but we were finally able to make this happen. And I'm so appreciative to be able to create the environment where you can share with the rest of the world. So thanks very much. So if you're watching or listening to this podcast for the first time, welcome. I hope something you've heard will encourage you to come back to a future episode. Previous episodes of the podcast can be found at psychealthandsafetyusa.com. You can watch, like, subscribe, and share the podcast on the Flourish DX YouTube page. And please do join the Psych Health and Safety USA movement by connecting and becoming a subscriber on LinkedIn. So until next time, stay tuned and look out for the next episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Tune in each week for new episodes of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. If you have a story or know of one that needs to be told, reach out to us on LinkedIn or send an email to david@id2-solutions.com or go to the Flourish DX website at flourishdx.com. We'll see you next time.